and a little extra frosting, and you have yourself a snack. Excuse me while I go eat this. Wondered how some people seem to get their cake layers so perfectly even? If you have, I've got some answers for you today. In this video, I want to give you 5 tips for how to bake more perfectly even cake layers. All right, so tip number 1, we've got to start with the basics, is to make sure that you're mixing your cake batter properly. So if you're not getting your batter mixed properly, say maybe there's streaks of butter or flour in it, it's much more likely that your cake layers are going to bake up unevenly. So you might end up with lopsided layers, you might have patches in your cake that sort of bubble up and spill over, or you might even end up with tunneling inside of your cake, all of which are not great. So that's why you really want to take the time up front and make sure that you're doing a good job of mixing your cake batter. This means that you're going to need to very carefully read and follow the instructions in your recipe, especially when you're directed to use room temperature ingredients. And if the term room temperature has ever confused you before, that just means somewhere in the range of 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 20 degrees Celsius. So if you live somewhere that's really, really hot or really, really cold, it might not be your actual room temperature, but that's the range that it's referring to. And it doesn't need to be exact, it just needs to be pretty close to that area. And the reason that this temperature is so important, especially if you're making butter-based cakes, is that it strikes a perfect balance where your ingredients are going to be warm enough that they mix together easily, but they're still going to be cool enough that the cake batter is going to retain its structure. So if you think about what an ideal cake batter is going to look like, it's going to have everything super evenly mixed, all homogeneous, but you don't have to overmix it to get to that point, and that's where the temperature is really important. Along those same lines of having a batter that's evenly mixed, it's always a good idea to stop every once in a while and scrape down the sides and the bottom of your bowl with a spatula just to make sure nothing gets left unmixed. And moving right along to tip number 2, which is to choose the right kind of cake pans. Now, you can totally bake your cakes in whatever kind of pan you like, and they're probably going to be okay. But if you're aiming for perfect layers, the cake pan really does make a difference. So in my opinion, the best cake pans are these anodized aluminum pans. These are great because they're really sturdy, but they're also lightweight, and aluminum is a really great conductor of heat, which is going to help your cake bake more evenly. And you do want to make sure that you're getting anodized aluminum, not just regular aluminum. And what that means, it's just that it's gone through a special finishing process that makes the cake pan resistant to corrosion. So that means you're going to be able to bake acidic ingredients like, say, a lemon cake or chocolate without having to worry about getting a metallic taste seeping into your cake. And also you don't have to worry about the cake pans ever rusting. As far as the size and the shape of pans, I do like to use straight-sided cake pans, and I prefer ones that have a taller side. So I usually really like these 6-inch, 3-inch tall cake pans. I do have some smaller ones that are 2 inches, but the taller pans tend to help the cakes bake a little bit more evenly. Also, this might seem obvious, but if you want your cakes to have straight sides, you need to have straight-sided cake pans, which is why you don't really want to use these sort of like cheapo cake pans. They just have a little bit of an angle, and that's going to make the sides of your cakes angled. So, like I said, I really like to use 6-inch cake pans, but the size doesn't really make a difference. It's just what you prefer. The sort of narrower, taller cakes are more in style right now, which is why I go for 6-inch cakes. And I use these Fat Daddy-O's brand. I can link them below for you. They're definitely a brand I would recommend. They have regular cake pans, and then they also have cheesecake pans, which look exactly the same, but they have a removable bottom, which is really nice, and it works just as well for cake batter. You don't have to worry about the batter leaking out. And then you can just pop the cake right out of the pan and not have to worry about it sticking to the bottom. And speaking of your cake sticking to the bottom of the pan, we're going to move into tip number 3, which is to grease your pans and also line them with parchment paper. Now, I feel like the classic or sort of old-fashioned advice is always to grease and flour your cake pans, which definitely works, but I would say it doesn't always work 100% of the time. There's kind of room for error in there. So I always line my pans with parchment paper. So what I like to do is just lightly grease my pan and then I drop a parchment paper circle into the bottom. It might seem a little bit annoying or tedious, but in my experience, this works 100% of the time, never fails, never had a cake stick like this. You can actually buy pre-cut parchment circles, but I just cut them myself. And if you want, you can just fold your parchment paper up, trace the bottom of your cake pan so you get an exact size, and then you can cut out a bunch of circles all at one time. And once your cakes are baked and cooled slightly, you can run a spatula or a knife around the outside of your pan, flip it over, and your cake should come out perfectly nice and neat with nothing sticking at all. Tip number 4 is to use a scale to measure out your cake batter and get an even amount in each pan. Not only do you want each of your layers individually to look nice and even, but you want every layer in your cake to be an even size. This is where a scale comes in really handy because you can use it to weigh your batter and divide it perfectly. So you can either look at your recipe and total up the weight if you have a recipe that's using weight measurements, or what I do sometimes is I actually take note of the weight of my mixing bowl. Like for example, I have this memorized now that my metal KitchenAid bowl is 755 grams when it's empty. So if you know the weight of your empty bowl, once you've made your cake batter, you can weigh that, subtract the weight of the bowl, and then divide by the number of cake pans that you want to use. So for example, for this cake that I'm making in this video, the glass bowl is around 2,100 grams. When I weighed the batter in the bowl, it was around 3,194 grams. So subtract out the weight of the bowl, you get around 1085, divide that by 3 layers, and you get 361. I usually scrape off a little bit off that total because you always lose a little bit of batter on the spatula, the beater, that kind of stuff. So I did 350 grams exactly in each cake pan. And finally, tip number 5 is to use baking strips to help your cakes bake more evenly. So baking strips are basically just gonna be a wet strip of fabric that you're wrapping around the outside of your cake pan. You can buy them pre-made. I know Wilton makes cake strips. I've also seen people make them with aluminum foil and wet paper towels. I actually just cut up these cheap old tea towels and that works perfectly fine. You don't need to do anything to like attach them. Once you wet the towel and wrap it around the cake pan, it stays up by itself. And this is free. So the way that they work is they're gonna help your cakes bake more evenly by keeping the sides of your cake pans cooler relative to what they would be without the baking strips. So when you use the baking strips, that moisture along the outside of your cake is going to sort of slow down the heating and the baking around the edge of your cake pan, and it's going to give the center a chance to catch up before the edges start to bake and crust over. Now I baked 2 layers here, one with a baking strip and one without, so that you can see the actual difference. The one that has the baking strip, you can see has sort of higher sides and it has a little bit less of a dome. The one that was without a baking strip has a much more pronounced dome on top and it didn't rise quite as high on the edges. Now, the amount that using baking strips is going to help your cake will vary a lot depending on the recipe. Some cake recipes just tend to bake flatter, while others are always going to have a really big dome and you're going to have to level them off no matter what. So it's not a huge difference, but it's a nice little trick to know about. And if you do have a cake that has a large dome on it, don't worry, you can always just cut it off. And I think I actually prefer that because then you get to snack on little bits of cake while you're putting it together. So those were my 5 tips for baking up perfectly even cake layers. If you guys have any questions, or if you have any other tips for people about how to bake up even cake layers, leave a comment and let me know. I'd love to hear about it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. Really though, having scraps is not that bad, because then you take the little scraps that you cut off your cake and a little extra frosting, and you have yourself a snack.
Excuse me while I go eat this.